Harlem, New York. In 1947, Bumpy Johnson was 41 years old, a powerful figure in the Harlem underworld, moving through the neighborhood as both a feared criminal and a known protector. On February 4th of that year, he was traveling along Lenox Avenue toward his office above the Palm Cafe, riding in a black Cadillac that marked his status without words. Harlem at that time was a crowded and struggling place. It was known for poverty, crime, and survival under pressure. Many residents lived one missed payment away from hunger or eviction. Heat and electricity could be shut off without warning. Violence existed not only in the streets, but inside homes, hidden behind closed doors. The weak endured quietly, and help from official systems was scarce. Bumpy Johnson operated within this world. He was one of the most powerful black figures in Harlem, controlling illegal gambling and commanding loyalty through fear and reputation. The environment rewarded strength, control, and decisiveness, punished hesitation, weakness, and dependence. Those who could not protect themselves often suffered in silence. On that cold afternoon, the city was unforgiving. The temperature was below freezing, and the wind cut through clothing. It was a setting where authority came not from law or government, but from those willing and able to act. In this place, Bumpy Johnson was already recognized as a man whose decisions carried weight, and whose patience, though often mistaken for restraint, had limits that were never crossed without consequence. By 1947, Bumpy Johnson had established himself as the undisputed power in Harlem's policy gambling world. He was respected, feared, and closely watched by rivals and police alike. His name alone carried meaning, and his presence altered behavior wherever he appeared. A former laborer and street fighter who had survived poverty in the South and violence in New York, Johnson carried himself with calm control. He did not rush. He listened. He observed. This measured demeanor often unsettled those around him more than open aggression. People understood that when he acted, it would be deliberate and final. Among Harlem residents, especially the poor and the elderly, Bumpy Johnson represented something complicated. He was a criminal, but he was also a figure who sometimes intervened when official systems failed. In a society dominated by racial inequality, economic neglect, and limited opportunity, he became a symbol of order enforced outside the law. Within a system controlled by landlords, utilities, and welfare offices that offered little protection, Johnson's authority filled a void. He was not gentle, but he was decisive. For many, that distinction mattered. His reputation was built not only on violence, but on the belief that once he involved himself in a situation, it would not be ignored, delayed, or dismissed. This reputation, carefully built over decades, set the stage for what would follow when a single act of desperation brought a suffering woman into his path and tested the limits of his restraint. But not everyone respected Bumpy Johnson. Some people lived outside fear not because they were strong, but because they had already fallen so far that consequences no longer mattered to them. One figure in particular was Edward Carter. He was not powerful, not organized, and not respected. But he embodied a different kind of danger. The danger of collapse. The danger of someone who had lost control of himself and no longer cared who he harmed. Edward Carter was a 43-year-old alcoholic who had spent years drifting between the streets, flophouses, and alleys. He was known for drinking heavily, losing jobs, and begging or stealing to survive. He believed that life had already cheated him, and that nothing he did could make it worse. That belief made him reckless. He had learned how to operate without immediate consequence. He drank openly. He slept where he could. He demanded money when he wanted it. And when he was refused, he lashed out. Not at strangers who could fight back, but at the one person weaker than himself, his elderly mother. Edward's danger did not come from planning or intelligence. It came from neglect, addiction, and despair. He was a man who had stopped fearing tomorrow, and men like that often cause the most harm. Edward Carter was able to continue his behavior by exploiting a broken system. His mother lived on welfare that provided only $11 a month. After rent, she had $3 left to survive. That money was not enough for food, heat, or electricity, let alone protection or safety. The authorities tolerated the situation because it was common. Elderly poor residents were overlooked. Welfare agencies moved slowly. Landlords shut off heat. Utility companies cut power. Domestic abuse inside poor households rarely brought attention, especially when the victim was old, black, and isolated. There were no regular checks, no follow-ups, no one enforcing protection. Edward knew this. He knew that no police officer would come looking for him. He knew that no court would intervene. He knew that his mother had no one to call. Over time, Edward came to believe he was untouchable. Not because he was feared, but because he was ignored. He believed he could drink, threaten, and strike without consequence. He believed the world had already decided he did not matter, and so nothing he did mattered either. That belief continued until the day his actions crossed into the path of someone who did not ignore such behavior, and who did not depend on broken systems to enforce limits. The first incident occurred during an ordinary moment that should have passed unnoticed. It was early in the morning, around 3 o'clock, inside a small Harlem apartment. There were no witnesses in the street, no police nearby, no public attention, only a mother and her son. Edward Carter came to his mother's door drunk, as he had many times before. He demanded money. When she told him she had none, he became angry. Without warning, he struck her. He knocked her to the floor, bruised her face, and injured her hip. Then he searched her apartment and took the single dollar she had hidden for emergencies. This was not done in public. It was not meant as a challenge. It was an act of habit. A small, cruel act repeated because it had been allowed before. Edward left without consequence, believing the moment would disappear like all the others. Bumpy Johnson was not there. He did not see the blow. He did not hear the argument. He did not respond. For 2 days nothing happened. Edward drank freely. Life continued. To anyone watching from the outside, this silence looked like nothing. No retaliation. No warning. No sign that the line had been crossed. To someone like Edward, the lack of response felt like permission. Those close to Bumpy Johnson expected a different outcome once the truth became known. Men who worked with him knew his history. They had seen what happened to people who abused the weak or preyed on the defenseless. They expected immediate action. But restraint was deliberate. Johnson did not rush. He listened. He gathered facts. He let the full weight of what had happened settle. His patience was not mercy. It was preparation. To those who did not understand the environment, the delay looked like weakness. It looked as though a powerless drunk had acted without consequence. It looked as though the system once again had failed. But those who truly understood Harlem knew better. They knew that when Bumpy Johnson waited, it meant something was coming. His silence was not confusion. It was control. And when he finally moved, it would not be loud, prolonged, or uncertain. In this world, patience was not hesitation. It was strategy. The next incident occurred later that same afternoon, in an alley behind a liquor store on 133rd Street. Edward Carter sat with other drunks, drinking openly, telling stories, laughing loudly. He spent the dollar he had stolen. No one stopped him. No one questioned him. Bumpy Johnson remained restrained. He did not send word. He did not confront Edward. He allowed the moment to pass. To Edward, this silence felt like safety. Another incident followed the next day. Edward returned briefly to his mother's building, knocking on doors, asking neighbors for money. He spoke badly about his mother when she refused to open her door. There was still no response. No warning. No consequence. Again, Bumpy Johnson did nothing. Edward's confidence grew. 2 days later, Edward was seen again in the same alley, more drunk than before. He boasted about taking money from his mother. He laughed about how she could not stop him. He believed no one cared. He believed no one would act. Each incident pushed the boundary further. Each day without consequence made Edward bolder. In places like Harlem, unchecked confidence becomes dangerous. It convinces the weak that they are safe. It convinces the reckless that rules do not apply to them. Edward did not understand that restraint was temporary. He believed the silence meant protection. He was wrong. Everything changed when the truth became visible. The boundary was crossed when Elizabeth Carter stood alone in the middle of Lenox Avenue, freezing, hungry, and bruised, stopping Bumpy Johnson's car with nothing but desperation. This was no longer hidden. The bruise on her face was clear. The cold was real. The suffering could not be ignored. She was elderly. She was starving. She had been beaten by her own son. The system had done nothing. Welfare had failed. Landlords had failed. Authority had failed. This moment crossed a line. From that point on, there was no delay, no misunderstanding, no restraint left to maintain. The problem was no longer abstract. It was personal. It was moral. The response from official authority remained minimal. No police arrived. No case was opened. No protection was offered. But from that moment forward, the outcome was inevitable. That evening, Bumpy Johnson spoke quietly. There was no anger in his voice. No raised tone. No public display. He did not make threats, and he did not speak in dramatic language. He spoke only to those closest to him. His driver. His bodyguard. Men who had been with him for years and knew his habits well. He said that a conversation needed to happen. He said a situation had reached its end. Johnson did not describe violence. He did not explain details. He stated only that a man who harmed his own mother would not be allowed to continue. He said the behavior would stop one way or another. Those who heard him understood the meaning. They knew his pattern. When Bumpy Johnson spoke this way, it meant the decision was already made. There would be no negotiation, no second warning. His calm was not mercy. It was finality. The setting of the final incident was ordinary. An alley behind a liquor store. Broken bottles on the ground. Men drinking from paper bags. The kind of place where nothing important was supposed to happen. Routine continued as usual. Edward Carter sat against a brick wall, drinking cheap whiskey, telling stories no one believed. Other men gathered nearby, passing time, waiting for the next bottle. There was no crowd, no stage, no announcement. That contrast made what followed unforgettable. Edward Carter escalated publicly. He spoke loudly in the alley, drunk and careless. He laughed about taking money from his mother. He dismissed her suffering as weakness. Other men heard him. This time there was no ambiguity. When Bumpy Johnson appeared at the entrance of the alley, Edward saw him too late. The laughter stopped. The bottles lowered. The air changed. Edward tried to stand. He tried to speak. But the truth was already clear. He had crossed the line in public. He had made his actions known. He had exposed himself. Bumpy Johnson stood still for a moment. He said nothing. His posture alone was enough. Everyone understood that this was no longer a misunderstanding. This was a reckoning. According to witnesses, everything happened in seconds. Johnson moved forward without hesitation. His actions were controlled and direct. There was no shouting, no chaos, just motion. He struck Edward once, hard and precise. It was not meant to kill. It was meant to end resistance. Edward fell. The alley went silent. Before anyone could intervene, the outcome was decided. Johnson delivered a final warning, clear and unmistakable. This behavior would never happen again. If it did, there would be no second chance. Then he stepped back. And it was over. No ambulance was called. No police arrived. The alley returned to stillness. But the message remained. In Harlem, patience had limits. And once crossed, consequences followed swiftly and without appeal. Bumpy Johnson stopped immediately after it was done. There was no continued violence. No chaos. No loss of control. The moment had reached its end, and he recognized it. He did not run. He did not shout. He did not raise his voice or his hands. His bodyguard stepped back. The alley remained quiet, filled only with the sound of Edward Carter breathing heavily on the ground. When attention turned toward Johnson, he made no effort to resist. He stood still, calm, composed. His face showed no anger, only certainty. What needed to happen had happened. Before being removed from the alley, Johnson spoke once. He did not explain himself. He did not justify his actions. He did not ask for understanding. He said only that a man who harms his own mother has already crossed the last line. And when that line is crossed, the outcome is decided. Those words stayed in the air long after he was gone. They were not a warning. They were a statement of fact. Johnson walked away without looking back. Edward Carter survived. But survival did not mean escape. He carried the physical pain of the encounter, but more lasting was the change in his behavior. He no longer believed himself invisible. He no longer believed his actions carried no weight. He did not return to the alley with the same confidence. He did not boast. He did not laugh about what he had done. The fear he carried was quiet, but constant. More importantly, the abuse stopped. Elizabeth Carter was not struck again. She was not threatened again. Her door was not kicked in during the night. Edward understood now that someone was watching. Someone who did not depend on broken systems or slow authorities. Someone who would act if the line was crossed again. Across Harlem, behavior shifted. Not loudly, not dramatically, but noticeably. Men who preyed on the weak became cautious. Drunks who thought consequences no longer applied to them reconsidered. People understood that neglect did not mean permission. The system had failed Elizabeth Carter. But the message delivered that day did not fail. No speeches followed. No second example was needed. The story traveled the way these stories always did. Quietly, carefully, passed from one person to another, always ending the same way, with understanding. In Harlem, patience could look like weakness. But everyone knew now what followed when patience ended. And no one needed to be told twice. When the events were later reviewed, a clear pattern emerged. Nothing that happened was sudden. Nothing came without warning. Each moment was connected to the one before it. There was escalation. Edward Carter did not begin with violence. He began with drinking, then with demands, then with anger. Over time, those demands turned into threats. Those threats turned into blows. Each step was worse than the last. There were warnings. They were not written. They were not official. But they were visible. Bruises, hunger, cold, silence. The kind of signs that appear when suffering has been going on for a long time. Elizabeth Carter lived without heat in winter. She lived without electricity. She lived without food for days at a time. These were not secrets. They were conditions created by neglect. The system failed at every level. Welfare payments were not enough to survive. Landlords shut off heat without fear of consequence. Utility companies cut power without checking who would suffer. No agency followed up. No authority checked on the elderly woman living alone. Because of that failure, Edward Carter learned something dangerous. He learned that nothing happened when he crossed lines. He learned that no one came. He learned that silence meant permission. By the time the situation reached Bumpy Johnson, the damage had already been done. The harm had repeated. The pattern was set. The only question left was whether it would continue. The conclusion was unavoidable. When systems fail long enough, resolution does not arrive through paperwork or procedure. It arrives through intervention. Long after the incident, the story continued to circulate. Not loudly, not publicly, but carefully. People did not repeat it for excitement. They repeated it because it explained something they already knew. They remembered an old woman standing in the cold. They remembered how close she came to disappearing without help. They remembered that nothing official stepped in. The story stayed alive because it carried meaning. In places like this, patience is often mistaken for weakness. Silence is often mistaken for acceptance. But patience has limits, and silence does not mean approval. When protection fails, people learn where real boundaries exist. Not written ones, enforced ones. The story remained not as praise, and not as warning, but as recognition. Recognition that neglect creates danger. Recognition that harm grows when ignored. Recognition that consequences do not vanish just because authority looks away. In places like this, justice does not always arrive politely, but it arrives. And everyone remembered that. In places where systems fail and suffering is ignored, consequences do not disappear. They only change shape, waiting quietly until someone is forced to act. This is why the story remains. Not as entertainment, and not as legend, but as a reminder of what happens when the vulnerable are left alone. It asks a simple question of everyone who hears it. Who steps in when no one else does? Remember the quiet moments. Remember the people who stood in the cold, unseen and unheard. And remember that silence is never neutral. If the story meant something to you, carry it forward. Speak about it. Share it. Pay attention when others are ignored. Because the next outcome depends on who chooses to act, and who chooses to look away.